What was just found off Australia's coast shouldn't exist. Stone tools, hundreds of them, sitting on the ocean floor in water so shallow a person could almost stand up in it, not fallen in from a boat, not washed off a cliff, placed there, deliberately by human hands, thousands of years before the water ever arrived. And that is exactly what makes this discovery one of the most jaw-dropping things ever pulled from the ocean floor anywhere on Earth. We are talking about an entire lost world sitting just beneath the surface, an ancient civilization's daily workspace, preserved perfectly, untouched, waiting at the bottom of the sea for someone to finally go looking. And here is the part that should stop you cold. This was not some remote, inaccessible trench deep in the middle of the ocean. Divers found these tools in water as shallow as 2.5 meters in places. Some of these artifacts are occasionally exposed during extreme low tides. This was hiding in plain sight, and for decades, centuries even, nobody looked. The story begins off the coast of Western Australia, in a stretch of ocean called the Dampier Archipelago, near a region known as Murujuga on the Pilbara coast. If you know anything about this part of Australia, you already know it is one of the most archaeologically rich places on the planet. More than 1 million individual rock engravings have been recorded on land in this region alone, making it one of the largest concentrations of ancient rock art anywhere in the world. The land itself is a living archive, but the land, it turns out, was only telling part of the story. Because when the last ice age ended, something enormous happened. Something that permanently erased a massive chapter of human history. The ice sheets melted, the sea levels rose, and they didn't rise by a little. When people first arrived in Australia as early as 65,000 years ago, sea levels were around 80 meters lower than they are today. Sea levels fluctuated but continued to fall as the global climate cooled. As the world plunged into the last ice age, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, sea levels dropped to 130 meters lower than they are now. Between 18,000 and 8,000 years ago, the world warmed up. Melting ice sheets caused sea levels to rise. Think about what that means for Australia specifically. The sea level rise flooded 2.12 million square kilometers of land on the continental shelf surrounding Australia. Thousands of generations of people would have lived out their lives on these landscapes now underwater. 2 million square kilometers. That is an area of inhabited, lived-in, worked-on land that simply vanished beneath the ocean. And everything those people left behind, every tool, every campsite, every fire pit, every structure went with it. Gone, swallowed, lost, or so everyone assumed. For as long as formal archaeology has existed in Australia, researchers worked almost entirely on dry land. That made sense. That is where the evidence was visible. That is where you could dig, sift, and document. The assumption baked into almost every major study of Aboriginal history was that the coastal story, the earliest chapters of human life in this country, were simply gone, drowned beyond recovery, an irreplaceable gap in the record that researchers had no choice but to accept and work around. That assumption turned out to be completely wrong. In 2019, a research team led by Dr. Jonathan Benjamin of Flinders University set out with a specific and almost audacious goal. Benjamin and colleagues report the results of several field campaigns between 2017 and 2019, during which they applied a series of techniques for locating and investigating submerged archaeological sites. The project was called the Deep History of Sea Country, funded through the Australian Research Council, and it operated on a simple but radical premise. If Aboriginal people had lived across this landscape for tens of thousands of years, and if the ocean had genuinely drowned a third of the continent's habitable land, then evidence of that life should still be sitting exactly where it was left, just underwater now instead of on dry ground. Nobody had ever confirmed anything like that existed in Australian waters before. The team was not just hoping to get lucky with a random dive. They built what they described as a predictive framework. They studied navigation charts, geological maps, and archaeological sites located on the land to narrow down prospective areas before surveying the seabed using laser scanners mounted on small planes and high-resolution sonar towed behind boats. They were looking for specific features: freshwater sources, sheltered channels, areas with stable terrain that early communities would naturally have gravitated toward, places where people actually wanted to live. Then they went diving. Within days, they knew they were right. At a location called Cape Bugar, in the Dampier Archipelago, the dive team mapped 269 artifacts at Cape Bugar in shallow water at depths down to 2.4 meters below modern sea level. Radiocarbon dating and analysis of sea level changes show the site is at least 7,000 years old. 269 individual stone tools, scattered across the seabed exactly where someone had left them, not tossed in randomly by waves or deposited by currents, but placed, worked, used, and set down in a spot that was dry land when they were last touched. The tools themselves tell a story of sophisticated, organized daily life. The first site, at Cape Bugar, comprises hundreds of stone artifacts, including mullers and grinding stones, on the seabed at depths down to 2.4 meters. Mullers, grinding stones, cutting tools, hammering implements. This was not a random scatter of debris. This was a toolkit, a working collection of purpose-built instruments suited to the full range of daily survival tasks. Food preparation, material processing, construction. These were not simple rocks. They were shaped, refined, and used over time by people who knew exactly what they were doing. One particular grindstone drew special attention from researchers. Its wear pattern was consistent with crushing seeds, and the working theory is that it may have been used specifically to grind seeds into a coarse flour, then baked into a form of bread. Let that land for a moment. Bread. Thousands of years before this technology was supposed to exist in this part of the world. A single stone, resting on the ocean floor, carrying evidence of a food processing technique so deliberate and so sophisticated that it challenges everything we thought we knew about the complexity of life along this ancient coast. And then came the second site, the one that tells an even stranger, even more striking story. A short distance away, in an area called Flying Foam Passage, researchers found something that made them stop and look twice. Flying Foam Passage is where the find spot is associated with a submerged freshwater spring at negative 14 meters. 14 meters below the surface of the ocean. A freshwater spring, still there, still identifiable, and clustered right beside it, stone tools, including a confirmed cutting implement crafted from locally sourced stone with a minimum age confirmed at 8,500 years old. Now think about why a freshwater spring matters so much. Freshwater in an arid landscape is not just a convenience. It is survival. It is everything. Communities form around freshwater. Territories are defined by it. People fight for it, protect it, and return to it generation after generation. A freshwater spring in the ancient Pilbara landscape would have been one of the most fiercely valued, most intensely occupied resources anywhere in the region. Exactly the kind of place you would build a life beside. Exactly the kind of place you would leave evidence of that life. And exactly the kind of place where, if the ocean swallowed it whole and someone went looking 8,500 years later, you might still find that evidence waiting right there beside the spring where it was left. That is what they found. That is what was sitting 14 meters underwater, undisturbed exactly as it was placed, for 8,500 years. Now here is where the scale of what this discovery actually means starts to become almost too large to properly process. Australia is a massive continent, but few people realize that more than 30% of its landmass was drowned by sea level rise after the last ice age. This means that a huge amount of the archaeological evidence documenting the lives of Aboriginal people is now underwater. Now we finally have the first proof that at least some of this archaeological evidence survived the process of sea level rise. The ancient coastal archaeology is not lost for good. We just haven't found it yet. That last line carries enormous weight. We just haven't found it yet. Because 2 sites have now been confirmed. 2 specific locations where ancient Aboriginal artifacts sat perfectly preserved under the ocean for thousands of years, which means the assumption that everything was lost was never actually true. It was just that nobody had looked. And if these 2 sites survived, intact and recoverable, then every reason to believe thousands more are sitting out there right now, along thousands of kilometers of drowned coastline, waiting. Researchers involved in the project have stated publicly that they believe there could be thousands of similar submerged sites scattered along the continental shelf. An entire hidden layer of Australian history, an entire chapter of the human story on this continent that has never been read because the pages were underwater and nobody opened them. These territories that are now underwater harbored favorable environments for indigenous settlements, including freshwater, ecological diversity, and opportunities to exploit marine resources, which would have supported relatively high population densities. This was not empty coastline. This was some of the most desirable real estate in ancient Australia. Sheltered bays, rich marine resources, freshwater, stable ground. The kind of places where populations concentrated, cultures developed, and histories accumulated over generations. All of it is down there, waiting. The methodology the team developed to find these 2 sites is now being applied across a much wider stretch of coastline. They are not guessing. They are not diving randomly and hoping to get lucky. They built a predictive map of the ancient drowned landscape, identifying exactly the kinds of geographical features that ancient communities would have clustered around. Freshwater access points, sheltered channels, elevated ground that would have stayed dry as waters slowly crept in. And they are working through that map systematically, one location at a time. The physical condition of the artifacts themselves surprised even the researchers. The conventional assumption in archaeology has long been that marine environments are hostile to preservation. Tidal movement, storm activity, currents, and marine organisms all work against the survival of anything left exposed on a seabed for any serious length of time. These 2 sites blow that assumption apart completely. Stone, unlike organic material, proved remarkably resilient even after thousands of years submerged. And the specific, comparatively sheltered geography of both Cape Bugar and Flying Foam Passage appears to have limited the kind of disruptive water movement that might otherwise have scattered artifacts across a far wider and far less coherent area. That combination of durable material and gentle local conditions is precisely what allowed archaeologists to recover such clearly defined, densely concentrated clusters of tools rather than isolated fragments. The seabed in these locations acted less like an open ocean floor and more like a sealed storage environment. And what was stored inside it has now been waiting, perfectly preserved, for 8,000 years. The challenge of actually working in that environment is its own story of scientific endurance. Chelsea Wiseman, a PhD student who worked directly on the discovery, described the experience as nothing short of a new frontier for Australian archaeology, an entirely different working environment requiring researchers to fundamentally rethink how excavation itself gets done. Every dive is constrained by visibility, by air supply, by the sheer physical difficulty of conducting careful, methodical, precise archaeological work while submerged. Unlike a land-based dig, where surrounding soil layers and nearby debris help reconstruct a fuller picture of daily activity, an underwater site strips away those surrounding clues. You are working with what you can see, what you can reach, and what the conditions allow you to examine before you have to surface. Follow-up surveys have continued adding to the picture. Researchers returned to Flying Foam Passage and recovered 4 additional stone artifacts, confirming its status as the deepest known Aboriginal archaeological site anywhere in Australian waters. The investigation is not concluded. It is ongoing. Each successive dive produces more evidence, refines the picture further, and pushes the boundary of what researchers understand about the life once lived in this now-drowned landscape. For the traditional owners of this coastline, the discovery carried a meaning that goes beyond scientific validation. Representatives from the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation, speaking on behalf of the 5 language groups recognized as custodians of this sea country, connected the underwater find directly back to oral traditions already held by community elders, stories describing this exact landscape long before any excavation confirmed what lay beneath the water. This was not new information delivered to a community from outside. It was confirmation arriving through the instruments of Western science of knowledge that had already been carried forward generation after generation, entirely independent of anything a research team could measure or date. Community CEO Peter Jeffries described the discoveries as something that would help the community tell the fuller story of their connection to this land and this sea, a connection that did not begin at the current waterline, but extends far out into the blue, onto what was once the inhabited, lived-in heart of this region. And then there's a layer to Flying Foam Passage that adds an almost unbearable weight to everything this discovery represents. Because this location is not only where an 8,500-year-old cutting tool was found beside a submerged freshwater spring, it is also the site of one of the most brutal massacres in Australia's colonial history. The Flying Foam Massacre was a massacre of Aboriginal people around Flying Foam Passage on Murujuga, the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia by colonial settlers. Comprising a series of atrocities between February and May 1868, the massacre was in retaliation to the killing of a police officer, a police assistant, and a local workman. Collectively, the atrocities resulted in the deaths of an unknown number of Djebarara people, but with estimates ranging from 15 to 150 dead men, women, and children. Up to 60 Djebarara people were killed at the site, in an area now globally recognized for its ancient rock art. It was a genocide, really. A whole group was destroyed, or nearly destroyed. The event ultimately wiped an entire Aboriginal language group off the map. Think about what it means to hold those two truths about the same stretch of water at the same time. 8,500 years ago, people knelt beside a freshwater spring in this exact place and worked stone tools as part of an ordinary day. They processed food, maintained their tools, lived their lives in a landscape they knew intimately and had occupied for countless generations before them. Then the water came. Slowly, over centuries, the ocean crept in and covered everything they had built and everything they had left behind. And 8,000 years later, in 1868, the descendants of those same people were hunted and killed by colonial settlers in the same waters where their ancestors' tools still rested on the seabed below. A place of ancient daily life, preserved under the ocean, surrounded by the evidence of what was done to the people who carried that history forward. That is what Flying Foam Passage holds. And a purely scientific reading of the archaeology can never fully capture what that means. The same waters holding these 2 confirmed sites now sit at the center of an urgent and very real modern conflict. The offshore waters are threatened by pipelines from the proposed Scarborough offshore gas platforms. The broader Murujuga region has become one of the most heavily industrialized stretches of coastline in the entire country. Major gas processing infrastructure already operates there, and proposed offshore pipeline expansion projects run directly through waters that may contain further undiscovered archaeological material. Researchers have specifically flagged the tension this creates. An urgent scientific need to properly survey and document a genuinely unprecedented category of heritage, site running directly up against active industrial development that could damage or destroy that evidence before anyone even gets the chance to find it. The findings outline the need for a national policy which ensures resource companies operate with care for Aboriginal heritage and develop protections against climate change, dredging, wind farms, interconnectors, and seabed mining while ensuring industry collaborates with Indigenous stakeholders and archaeologists. Legal protection for this kind of discovery is still extremely new in real terms. Australia's Underwater Cultural Heritage Act only came into effect in 2019, the same year the first survey that led to these discoveries was conducted. The previous law had focused almost exclusively on protecting historic shipwrecks, with virtually no framework for submerged Indigenous heritage sites. Cape Brugheres and Flying Foam Passage represent exactly the kind of discovery that law was never originally designed to anticipate. Not a sunken ship, an entire drowned landscape, walked, worked, and lived on for thousands of years by people whose descendants remain the rightful custodians of that sea country today. The race between discovery and destruction is real. Every month that passes without a comprehensive survey of this coastline is a month during which industrial activity, natural erosion, or simple neglect could permanently eliminate evidence that has already survived 8,000 years under the ocean. Evidence that made it through ice ages, sea level rise, thousands of years of marine growth, and millennia of tidal movement, only to face the risk of being destroyed by machinery in the 21st century. What sits beneath the waves off the Pilbara coast is not a ruin. It is not the kind of dramatic wreckage most people picture when they think of something lost to the sea. It is a working landscape, exactly as it was left. Grinding stones still sitting where someone once knelt beside them to prepare food. A cutting tool resting beside the freshwater spring where it was almost certainly used and then set down. These ancient cultural landscapes do not end at the waterline. They continue into the blue, onto what was once dry land. The people who left these tools behind did not lose them suddenly. Sea levels rose gradually enough over centuries and generations that the communities living along this ancient coast had time to adjust, to move inland, to relocate as the water crept closer and the landscape they had known since childhood slowly disappeared beneath the tide. They did not flee in a day. They adapted across lifetimes. But what they left behind stayed exactly where it was. And now we know it is still there, not gone, not destroyed, not beyond recovery, just waiting in shallow water off the northwest coast of Australia for the archaeology to catch up with a history that never actually disappeared. The two confirmed sites are proof of something that changes everything about how we understand Australian prehistory. They prove that the assumption of loss was false. They prove that the ocean did not erase this history. It preserved it, sealed it in place, protected it from erosion, from interference, from everything except time. And time, it turns out, was not enough to destroy it. Which means the real question is not whether more of this evidence exists. The researchers are very clear that it does. The real question is how much is still out there, how quickly it can be found, and whether the world will pay enough attention to protect it before the machinery of modern industry finishes what the Ice Age started. Managing, investigating, and understanding the archaeology of the Australian continental shelf in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional owners and custodians is one of the last frontiers in Australian archaeology. The results represent the first step in a journey of discovery to explore the potential of archaeology on the continental shelves, which can fill a major gap in the human history of the continent. A first step. That is all this was. 2 sites, a few hundred tools, 1 submerged freshwater spring, 1 grinding stone that may carry evidence of bread making 8,500 years ago. And already, the picture of what we thought we knew about this continent's human story has been torn open and rewritten. Somewhere further along that drowned coastline, in water that no one has properly surveyed yet, more of it is almost certainly still down there, sitting exactly where it was left, waiting for the next team willing to go looking beneath the surface, and the history that was supposed to be lost forever is going to keep coming back up, one dive at a time, until the full story of this country is finally told.